Juarez Square. Me? Diego asked. What does El Carnicero want with me? Pedro shrugged. I don't know, Way. He just told me to come get you. And best not keep him waiting. Diego swallowed. He shouldn't have opened the door. Your brother around? Pedro asked, stepping closer. He craned his neck to look behind Diego into the apartment. He's at work. Diego backed away from the older boy and closed the door halfway. Pedro smiled. What's the matter, little Diego? You scared without Big Brother here to protect your ass? Para nada, Diego shot back, raising his chin, trying to look older and braver than his 15 years. Sure you're not scared, Pedro mocked. Diego knew the older boy was baiting him. Pedro wasn't the cleverest kid in El Cuatro. But even so, he couldn't close the door and hide in the house. That was the kind of thing a scared kid would do. He swung the door all the way open. Let's go. The sun blazed down mercilessly from a cloudless sky, baking El Cuatro's streets with the dry furnace heat of a South Texas summer. The streets were mostly empty, the locals taking refuge from the midday sun indoors, waiting for the long shadows of late afternoon to bring a few degrees of relief. A scattering of junkies wandered about like zombies, looking for a fix. Beads of sweat formed on Diego's forearms, then quickly evaporated, leaving his skin sticky with salt. He followed the older boy along the cracked, uneven sidewalk toward the south side of town. Anxious minutes passed as Diego fretted over what El Carnicero, the local narco boss, might want with him. But the more he thought about it, the less he worried. Pedro had always been a prankster. He probably just needed a goalie for a soccer game, and he thought it would be fun to mess with Diego's head. Yes, that had to be it. A soccer game. I'm glad your brother wasn't home, Way, Pedro said. Lorenzo never would have let you come with me. He shook his finger in mock disapproval. Now you'll be a good boy like me and stay away from those narcos. Diego winced at the insult, but covered it with a chuckle. He thinks he's my dad. I can take care of myself. As Diego followed, he noticed the older boy's shoes. They were new and white and store-bought. So much nicer than his own thin-soled hand-me-downs from Lorenzo. Pedro was getting paid. They cut through an abandoned warehouse and then down a narrow alley crowded with taco stands and street peddlers whose wares were laid out on dirty, frayed blankets. Flimsy, sun-yellowed tarps shaded the vendors as they sat about, moving as little as possible in the oppressive heat, waiting for the afternoon crowds to return. The boys picked their way through the alley. Don Pedro! An old man shouted, rising from his stool to shake the older boy's hand. A short, round woman chopping cilantro wiped her hands on her apron and handed Pedro a bundle of tacos wrapped in foil. This is for your jefe. Tacos al pastor, his favorite. She smiled, silver teeth gleaming as she handed him another. And these are for you. Chorizo con queso, just the way you like it. More vendors fawned over them, offering smiles and more free food. An old man, seeing Diego empty-handed, gave the younger boy a paper cone of cherry-flavored crushed ice and patted him on the shoulder. This is my pleasure, young man. My pleasure. Diego looked at the man for a moment. He was the same cranky old fart who only a week earlier had threatened Diego with an ice pick for smiling at his granddaughter. Now he was all smiles and ass kisses. Pedro nodded at Diego and winked, as if he were reading the younger boy's thoughts. Nice to have friends and respect, isn't it? Respect. The word echoed in Diego's head. Pedro the Joker had that rare commodity every kid in El Cuatro coveted. The respect of the street. The boys exited the alley and a narco bot passed in front of them. The green trash can-shaped machine rolled along the sidewalk, its red eye scanning for customers. The expression he'd heard countless times popped into Diego's head. Looking for pot? Find a green bot. He paused and pondered the machine as he bit into the sweet, deliciously cold crushed ice. It was an old Ono Hiroshi R57, a sturdy factory bot converted to sell weed. Diego pictured its innards. The large dispensing basket packed with plastic-wrapped ounces and half-ounces, the impenetrable cash box, the deadly defensive systems ready to fry anyone who tried to do anything but insert bills into its money slots.
"Hey, you trying to get your huevos fried or what?"
Pedro called. The older boy motioned for him to follow.
"Hurry up. He gets pissed when people are late."
They continued walking, and as they approached the river at the edge of town, the sinking feeling Diego had back at the apartment returned. All around him were crumbling brick buildings and empty lots. There were no places to play soccer in this part of town. A minute later, they arrived at the river and the big bridge. A pair of stray dogs sniffed through clumps of weeds growing up through the large fissures in the concrete, but otherwise the bridge was empty. Pedro leaned over the handrail and peered down at the trickle of greenish water in the muddy riverbed. He scratched his chin.
Puta madre. Ever wonder why they built such a big bridge over such a tiny piss of a river?
Diego swallowed a snicker. It wasn't always like this. There used to be cars on this bridge every day, packed bumper to bumper. He pointed to the dilapidated buildings at the bridge's center. Over there they had men with guns checking papers, dogs sniffing for weed, cameras taking pictures of everybody's face when they crossed over.
"The fuck you say?"
Pedro looked at Diego like he was crazy. "You didn't know this was a border bridge? Un puente de la frontera? We're standing in the States, and over there is Mexico." The older boy made a face.
"Shit, I know that,"
he snapped, though his eyes lacked the conviction of his voice.
"I ain't no genius like you, but I know that much."
He turned and started across the bridge. Diego followed. As they approached the Mexican side, a yellow narco bot appeared a couple blocks to the south. It rolled to a stop, paused, then turned onto a street and disappeared from view. Buy meth from a yella, and you'll be a happy fella. Yellow bot turf was meth turf, and meth turf was narco turf. Diego's stomach tied itself into knots. There wasn't going to be a soccer game. Turn around and run away. The thought repeated itself over and over in Diego's head as the boys approached a small fabric store. He forced his legs to keep following, fighting down the animal urge to flee from danger, trying to ignore his pounding heart. You didn't bail on a meeting with El Carnicero, not if you wanted to live another day. The boys passed through the doorless entrance. The front room was packed with large bolts of cloth of all colors, strewn about in messy piles that reminded Diego of a child's discarded crayons. Two women working on treadle sewing machines in the corner glanced up at them for a moment, then returned to their garments without saying a word or breaking the steady rhythm of their pedaling.
"Through here,"
Pedro said, his voice low, expression serious. No longer Pedro the Joker. Diego followed him into the small back room. Empty except for two folding chairs on opposite sides of a card table. The older boy closed the door and motioned to the far chair. Diego sat. Minutes passed, and neither boy spoke. Diego tried to slow his breathing, tried to hang on to the fading hope it was all an elaborate scare prank. He started at the sound of the door flying open. Two large men strode into the room, shotguns strapped to their backs. Sharp eyes, hard faces. Bodyguards. Pedro quickly got out of their way, moving to the corner of the room. One of the men pulled out a weapon sniffer and waved it over Diego's body with quick, practiced precision. He nodded to the other bodyguard, who then turned to the doorway and said, "Todo bien, jefe." A short, pudgy man with plain clothes entered the room. Diego stared and blinked. He'd been expecting someone the size of a wrestler to stomp through the door. a man who fit the larger-than-life reputation. Could this really be him? This man who looked more like a taco vendor than a narco boss? A glance at Pedro's anxious expression erased his doubts. Diego chewed on his lower lip as El Carnicero sat across from him and looked him over.
My God, you're whiter than a gringo,
the narco boss said. He tossed a coin at Pedro.
Go get our guest a soda.
The boy hustled out of the room.
Your friend says you know a lot about robots.
Diego's throat was tight and dry. Yes, sir. He worried what Pedro, who was always prone to exaggeration, might have said.
Who taught you? Your father?
My brother taught me, he said. He fixes bots for the university. My dad lives in California, last I heard.
And your mom?
Diego looked at the floor. She got sick and died last year. The narco boss stroked his razor stubble and nodded sympathetically.
I lost my parents when I was young. Cried myself to sleep for years, missing Mommy and Papi.
He raised his eyebrows.
I hear you fix Father Sanchez's robots. Better than new.
Pedro returned and placed a can of soda on the table in front of Diego. El Carnicero looked up at the boy, annoyed.
What about mine?
Pedro's mouth dropped open and his eyes widened. The narco boss flipped another coin at the boy, who caught it and scrambled away to fetch another drink. El Carnicero cracked a smile, and the bodyguards chuckled.
We were talking about robots, he said,
turning his attention back to Diego.
Do you know why I like them so much?
Diego shook his head. The soda can dripped with condensation in the dank heat of the small room.
Robots don't skim money from me. They don't smoke the inventory, and they work a corner until every junkie spends his last peso. Those little machines work the streets better than people ever did. Way better.
Diego forgot his fear for a moment, losing himself in the man's easygoing charm. But then he stiffened again, reminding himself the kind-faced man sitting across from him had earned, with countless brutalities, the nickname El Carnicero, the butcher. The narco boss raised a finger.
But there's one thing my bots aren't very good at, and that's getting away from police.
Why would they need to get away from police? Everybody knew El Carnicero paid the police to let the narco bots roam the streets hassle-free.
Have you heard about the new police chief?
The man asked. No, sir. A cloud came over the narco boss's face.
That new police chief likes to have his fat face on the news. Likes to think of himself as the big man not afraid to take on the narcos. Pinche cabrón. Last week he raided Juarez Square and jacked 4 of my bots.
But the shockers, how could they just take them? The ugly aftermath of an attempted bot jacking near his apartment flashed across his mind. The acrid smell of the charred body in the middle of the street. The narco boss shrugged.
Shockers are good for pendejos on the street who think they can crack open a bot for easy money. But police have big budgets and smart technicians. Not easy for a little bot to fight against such things.
Diego nodded. For a street hustler, bot jacking meant certain death. If the shocker didn't do you in, the tracker hidden deep inside would. When a bot was picked up or pushed even a single meter off its programmed route, El Carnicero's men showed up in less than a minute, guns blazing. Diego had never heard of a successful bot jacking. And the narco boss was right about the police. For a police force with good equipment, capable engineers, and an incorruptible leader, it wouldn't be very hard to get bots off the streets. Not very hard, but definitely foolish. Diego wondered what kind of reckless idiot would take on the butcher on purpose.
This new police chief is a real church boy, the narco boss said. Thinks he's too high and mighty to take my money. Thinks he's as pure as La Virgen de Guadalupe.
He made a disgusted face.
The day after he took my bots, he went on the news telling everyone Juarez Square is clean.
The butcher repeated,
Juarez Square is clean.
as if it were the worst possible insult. Pedro entered the room, breathing heavily, holding another can of soda. He gingerly placed it in front of the narco boss and took his place in the corner. El carnicero reached over and popped open the can.
Something tells me this new police chief won't be around much longer. But until he...
The man paused before uttering the next word, glancing over at the bodyguards.
retires, I can't just lay down like a scared dog, can I?
He leaned in closer.
I have a reputation to think about.
He took a long drink.
This hijo de puta is daring me, in front of the whole world, to put my bots back in Juarez Square, so that's what I'll do.
He took a second drink and added, with your help. Diego shivered, the words striking him like a blast of cold air. The narco boss watched him carefully, studied his reaction.
Father Sanchez says you're a clever boy. I was a clever boy at your age too. Not clever with bots, but clever in other ways. Clever enough to make a bit of money and earn some respect. That's all a boy from El Cuatro could ever want, no?
Diego blinked and stared.
Yes, I grew up in El Cuatro just like you. Hidalgo Street's my home turf.
He reached over, opened the other soda can, and handed it to Diego.
Smart boys from El Cuatro should stick together, don't you think?
He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. Then he said,
All I want to do is ask you a few things.
The man questioned him about robots, exploring the limits of the boy's expertise. Diego told him everything he knew. What the little converted factory bots could do and couldn't do, the mods he knew about, the other mods he'd only thought about but never tried. His mind raced nervously, searching for the right answers, imagining what a wrong answer or an I don't know might mean for him. But the more they talked, the less Diego worried. He knew who this man was, knew the terrible power he wielded. But even so, he felt the tension in his shoulders easing, the knot in his stomach relaxing. Maybe it was the man's easy way of talking. Maybe it was because he was a homeboy from the same neighborhood. But there was something about this man he hadn't counted on. Diego took a thirsty gulp of soda. The cold, sweet fizziness soothed his parched throat. It was just what he needed. 10 seconds, Diego. It takes all of 10 seconds to write a note and tell me where you're going. You can't be bothered to do that much? When Diego had finally shown up at home 2 hours past dinner time, he found his brother Lorenzo fuming. He sat at the small kitchen table as Lorenzo plated a dinner of tacos and beans and placed it in front of him. A cool breeze and the busy din of the streets came through the open window. I said I was sorry. Lorenzo sat across from him. So where were you? Just around. Who are you with? Some kids. What does it matter? Lorenzo glared at him. I saw that idiot Pedro through the window when you came back. He's not an idiot. He's messing around with the wrong people. I don't want you hanging out with him anymore. The TV on the counter was running a news report on last week's bot raid at Juarez Square. An image of the new police chief, who Diego thought looked like a real pendejo with a stick up his butt, flashed onto the screen as the news lady gave the latest update. Still no drug activity in Juarez Square. Lorenzo slapped the table like he'd seen a game-winning soccer goal. That's the way to do it. That's how you take on that old narco bastard. Take it right to him. He pointed at the television. We could use more men like this around here these days. Diego scoffed. That pinche church boy just likes to have his face on TV. Lorenzo waved his hand, dismissing the comment. What do you know? Diego's cheeks warmed with anger. Every day, it was the same shit. Lorenzo playing daddy, even though he was only 4 years older, acting like he knew everything, knocking down whatever Diego said like he was some stupid kid. But this time, Diego resisted the urge to snap back the way he always did. That's the kind of thing Lorenzo expected, the kind of thing a kid would do. A man played it cool and controlled, like the butcher played it today. He leaned back in the chair and crossed his arms. I know he ain't gonna keep bots out of Juarez Square, that's what I know. Lorenzo narrowed his eyes. Diego felt a self-conscious rush of adrenaline, as if his brother could figure out where he'd been just by studying his face. Lorenzo stood and towered over him. Where did you really go with Pedro today? Tell me right now. Knowing how his brother felt about narcos, he considered the low-hassle option of sticking to the lie. Then Lorenzo slapped his shoulder hard, leaned in, and pointed his finger in Diego's face. You tell me right now, niño. Diego sprang out of the chair, his shoulder stinging, and lifted his chin defiantly. El carnicero! I met the butcher! Lorenzo took a step backward. His face looked like a boxer's who'd been hit with a surprise gut shot. He sat down slowly and stared at the table, shaking his head. In a near whisper, he said, The butcher? My God, Diego, what have you gotten yourself mixed up in? Diego had never seen fear in his brother's eyes before. The very idea of a frightened Lorenzo was something unthinkable. Lorenzo with his broad, muscled shoulders, who never lost a fight, who no one ever messed with. Diego found it at once thrilling and unsettling that a few words from his mouth could shake his brother to the core. Lorenzo took a breath. What did he want with you? Diego shrugged. Answer me, goddammit! He asked me about robots. Robots? What about robots? Lorenzo narrowed his eyes. He pressed until Diego gave up the details of the butcher's questions about mods and upgrades. As Diego spoke, his brother glanced back at the TV, then furrowed his brow like he was putting the pieces together. The new police chief, the raid on Juarez Square, the narcos' questions about robots. Lorenzo stood up quickly, shut the window, and closed the curtains. You stay away from Pedro, you hear me? And I don't want you going anywhere near that narco again. Diego clasped his hands behind his neck. You worry too much. El carnicero's not so bad. Did you know he's from El Cuatro? Even as he tried to appear unworried, his stomach fluttered with the memory of his meeting with the narco boss. Listen to me, Lorenzo pleaded. It doesn't matter if he's from our turf or Mars. When a narco goes to war, you don't want to be anywhere near it. Things get bloody and messy real fast. I can take care of myself. Lorenzo grabbed him by the upper arm, nearly toppling him over. If I have to lock you in your room, I'll do it. You hear me? His brother's breath blew hot and angry on his face. Diego yanked his arm away. What's the matter? Pissed he came to me instead of you? What? You're jealous I know more about bots than you do. Lorenzo laughed. Is that what you think? Jesus. He shook his head. Truth hurts, don't it? Right, the truth. You want the truth? The truth is, he didn't ask me because he knew I wouldn't come. He knows I'm not a dumb kid he can fool with a smile and a wink and some narco line of crap. You're a mark, little brother. And I'll be damned if I let you use what I taught you to help that animal. End of story, you got me? As his brother spoke, Diego felt a pressure building inside him, the rumbling of a volcano. He couldn't take another word of it. He wouldn't. The words exploded out of him in a fiery rage. Fuck you, asshole! Diego stormed out of the apartment, slamming the door behind him. He ran down the street without looking back, not knowing or caring if Lorenzo was coming after him. He ran until he reached the big bridge exhausted and panting, tears streaming down his cheeks. Lorenzo wasn't his father. He couldn't tell him who he could see and who he couldn't. Diego didn't have a father or a mother, and he didn't need any. Diego whistled as he moved his wide-eyed gaze around the old warehouse.
No mames way.
Pedro nodded.
What did I tell you?
For Diego, who loved nothing more than working on robots, the warehouse that served El Carnicero's bot workshop was heaven on earth. The immense space had every tool and diagnostic machine one could possibly need to repair a robot or even build one from scratch. Pedro introduced him to the shop mechanic Fernando, a slow-talking man Diego guessed was around 60, who showed him around. Diego marveled at so much expensive tech in one place. The interface terminals, shiny and new, the latest models from Ono Hiroshi. A dozen state-of-the-art diagnostic stations, the endless variety of hand tools, the vast spare parts inventories. His mind raced with possibilities, the things he could do here. Fernando shoved his hands into the front pockets of his greasy coveralls and said,
They tell me you're a robot genius.
Diego felt a rush at the compliment, but he tried not to show it.
I've worked on bots since I was a kid. You know bot code?
Sure.
Good, Fernando said. We could use somebody like you around here. I can fix a broken wheel or a hydraulic arm as good as anybody, but I don't speak no bot languages.
The warehouse doors flew open with a bang, and El Carnicero strode into the shop, flanked by the same two bodyguards from the day before. One of the bodyguards held a melon-sized bag of ice. Diego's insides churned with a strange kind of anxiety he'd never felt before, part fear and part excitement, as the narco boss approached, shook his hand, and gave him a broad, gold-toothed grin.
Lots of nice toys here, no?
Yes, sir, Diego said. Increíble. The butcher clapped his hands and rubbed them together.
You ready to help old man Fernando here do some upgrades for me?
Diego shot a confused look at Pedro, who raised his eyebrows and gave him an almost imperceptible nod, a signal to play along. Puta madre. He already told him I'd do it. Fucking Pedro. Diego's pulse quickened. He swallowed and said, Sir, the things we talked about yesterday, the upgrades? I've never done them before. They were just ideas. The narco boss nodded.
I see. Well, I tell you what. If you can make those ideas happen, you'll get a very nice payday.
He lowered his chin.
More than your brother makes fixing janitor bots at the university. Much more.
Diego shuddered at the mention of his brother. How did he know about Lorenzo? Then he remembered a narco boss had eyes and ears everywhere. Anything the street knew, El Carnicero would know. When Diego hesitated, the narco boss said,
Things have changed a bit since we spoke yesterday, my boy. Last night, I rolled my bots back into Juarez Square.
He chuckled.
And the new police chief wasn't very happy about it. Then, we learned from, shall we say, a friend we have in the police department, that tomorrow morning, they're going to raid my bots again.
Diego blinked. The narco boss motioned around the warehouse.
You've got all these tools and old Fernando to help you.
He fixed his eyes on Diego.
But I need some of those upgrades you know so much about, ready by tomorrow morning.
Tomorrow morning? The words hit him like a punch in the stomach. There was no way. He cursed himself for not listening to Lorenzo. His mind raced for a reply that wouldn't get him killed.
Sir,
he said, his voice cracking.
I'm not sure one day is enough time to...
El Carnicero raised his hand, cutting him off.
I thought you might have some doubts. A smart boy like you, I understand.
He looked at the bodyguards, nodded, then added,
So I thought I'd give you some motivation.
One of the bodyguards grabbed Pedro by the upper arm and brought him over to a table. The other followed them, holding the bag of ice with one hand and swiping the mess of spare parts and tools to the floor. Pedro's face twisted with panic as they forced his arm onto the table. Diego watched in horror. Fernando turned away.
I know the best doctors in the city,
the narco boss said calmly.
They can do almost anything these days, even replace a finger that's been off a hand for a whole day. Imagine that. In the old days, if you waited more than a few hours to get it back on, forget it. But now, even after a whole day, they can pop it on good as new. You have to keep it on ice, of course.
The larger bodyguard held Pedro's hand in place while the other pulled out a hunting knife. Pedro squirmed and pleaded with them to stop, then suddenly howled in pain as the bodyguard leaned onto the blade, forcing it down through the boy's index finger. Pedro's eyes rolled back and his body went limp as he passed out. Blood flowed from the stump and pooled under the severed digit. The bodyguards worked with clinical precision, stemming the blood flow, wrapping the boy's hand in bandages, and placing the detached finger in the ice bag. The larger man threw the unconscious boy over his shoulder and left through a side door. Diego's stomach lurched, and he forced himself to breathe deeply to keep from throwing up. He was suddenly aware of the chill of sweat on his forehead, the weakness in his legs. The narco boss idly ran his finger through the pool of blood on the table and drew a smiley face doodle.
I know 22 hours isn't a lot of time, but I have faith in you, my boy. And when the job is done and everything goes fine, I'll have the doctors put his finger back on good as new.
Diego barely registered the narco boss's words, the horror of what he'd just witnessed blaring in the front of his mind. He looked down at his hands and fingers. El carnicero noticed this and laughed.
Don't worry, my boy. You do a good job with my bots, and you'll get to keep all 10 of yours.
A dull orange sun rose over the eastern horizon, its edges blurred and indistinct in the hazy blanket of the city's smog. Diego stood on the roof of a 10-story building overlooking Juarez Square, watching the sunrise, wondering if it would be his last one. His brain felt like mush, and his fingers and forearms ached from working on robot chassis all night. On a normal morning at this hour, he'd be watching the sun as it rose above the laundromat in front of the apartment, while he and Lorenzo ate breakfast. Was his brother eating breakfast now, sitting alone in the kitchen wondering where Diego was? Had he come looking for him? Or had Lorenzo finally had enough of being a substitute parent and thrown up his hands? A lump formed in Diego's throat. Lately, he'd given Lorenzo plenty of reasons to give up on him, questioning every decision, making fun of his job repairing janitor bots, saying something was white just because Lorenzo said it was black. If Diego lived through the day, he vowed things would be different. He'd make it up to Lorenzo and stop acting like a child. El Carnicero's bodyguards finished setting up a wide tarp so police drones couldn't see them from overhead. The narco boss sat underneath in a folding chair eating breakfast tacos. Meat juice and bits of tortilla streamed down his chin. A bodyguard brought a couple foil-wrapped packages to Diego and Pedro, but neither boy ate. Pedro coddled his injured hand and didn't speak.
Not eating, boys?
The narco boss asked.
Don't know what you're missing.
He wiped his mouth with his sleeve. Down below the square was empty except for the 4 yellow bots Diego had worked on through the night. He chewed his lower lip and watched as they moved about the streets. There hadn't been time to test anything, neither the new gear nor the lines of code he'd loaded only half an hour ago. Nothing to do now but watch and wait for the police to show up. An hour passed as the square slowly came to life. Shopkeepers unlocked their storefront cages, food vendors busily set up their kiosks. Pedestrian traffic began to fill the walkways. The bots worked their way through the crowds, ignored and unmolested. The narco boss lifted a pair of binoculars to his eyes, then pointed beyond the square.
Here they come.
Diego's pulse raced as he searched the streets. Then he saw it. An armored personnel carrier rolling toward the square. 4 state police accompanied the vehicle on foot, a pair on each side. "Look, there's another one," one of the bodyguards said. Everyone on the roof turned to look. Another personnel carrier, flanked by 4 more cops. The boys skirted the edges of the roof, spotting 2 more groups. They're hitting the square from all 4 sides. Diego quickly did the math, counting the cops he saw, guessing the numbers of those riding inside the carriers. Puta madre. He hadn't counted on there being so many. The 4 groups converged, each pausing as they reached the square's perimeter. Panicked shouts reached the rooftop as the people down below scrambled for the safety of the side streets. Shop owners quickly closed their storefronts. Food vendors wheeled away their kiosks. Within a minute, Juarez Square was empty of people. Only the 4 narco bots remained, rolling along, seemingly oblivious. Diego's heart dropped into his stomach. They should have done something by now. What was wrong? After 10 long seconds, the bots froze as they detected the police vehicles. In unison, they clamped their dispenser baskets shut and converged in the center of the square, arranging themselves back to back, one facing each direction. El Carnicero glared at Diego and pointed down to the square.
Why aren't they getting away? Why are they just sitting out there in the open?
Diego took a shaky breath. That's what they're supposed to do. Police in full riot gear poured from the personnel carriers and quickly formed a wide ring around the 4 bots. Diego counted heads, grimacing as he reached 40. Jesus, so many. The police raised their riot shields and began to inch forward, tightening the circle, closing in. One of them raised a bot taser and took aim. The bots didn't move. El Carnicero slammed his fist on the rooftop's ledge.
What the hell is this? Are they just going to sit there like statues? Get them the hell out of there!
He thrust his face so close to Diego's, their noses nearly touched.
If that hijo de puta gets even one of those bots, he snarled, you're gonna wish I only cut off your finger.
Diego froze, the movie of his life rushing through his mind, the things he wanted to tell Lorenzo that would be left unsaid. Hey, look! Cried one of the bodyguards. Diego and the narco boss turned and looked downward. The 4 bots raised the small add-on cylinders. El Carnicero squinted.
What are those things?
A quick succession of 4 cracks rang out as the bots fired the grenades. The perimeter of the square began to fill with dark green smoke. Within seconds, the police and their vehicles were engulfed in the thick cloud. One of the bodyguards on the rooftop laughed as the sounds of confused shouts and panicky orders filled the square. The police were blind. The narco boss grunted.
Nice trick, but they'll be switching to infrared in about 2 seconds. What then?
No, Diego said, surprised at the confidence in his voice. They only pack those at night. Still, the smokescreen was the easy part. The bots were still surrounded, with all the exit streets blocked by personnel carriers. The muscles in Diego's neck and shoulders tightened as the dark cloud blanketing the square began to dissipate. The bots were just becoming visible again. There wasn't much time. Through the thinning smoke, Diego watched the bots raise their other add-ons, the larger canisters, then begin to fire. Everyone jumped away from the edge of the roof. Even Diego, who knew what was coming, instinctively dropped to his knees. When the shooting stopped, he got up, stepped back to the building's ledge, and peered down into the square. Where there had been shouts of confusion moments earlier, there were now howls of pain and terror. The narco boss appeared next to him, eyes wide.
Dios mío, did you kill them?
No, but they're definitely having a bad day. The ammo was only those small rubber balls, the kind they use on protesters. The balls knocked you down and hurt like crazy, but couldn't kill. And most importantly, they bought the bots precious moments to make their escape. The center of the square was now almost smoke-free as the bots broke formation and started scanning for an exit. Come on. Find a way out of there, you little yellow bastards. El Carnicero leaned forward.
The bots can see through the smoke.
He turned to Diego, who kept watching the bots.
And the cops can't,
Diego said, finishing the thought. The robots wandered the square in apparent confusion, repeating the same circular search patterns over and over. Diego gasped as one of the police, apparently blinded, staggered within an arm's length of one of the bots. The smoke thinned further. Now more than half the square was visible from the rooftop. The bots would be spotted any second, and with their weapons depleted, they'd be easily disabled and taken away. The 4 bots suddenly came to a halt, and Diego's heart stopped. After a long moment that seemed to stretch forever, the robots began to move, forming a line and snaking their way around the chaotic debris of bodies and equipment, then disappearing into the smoke at the far side of the square. Diego held his breath until he saw all 4 appear in a narrow side alley, untouched and unnoticed. He watched them roll their way 3 blocks south to the arranged pickup spot where Fernando the mechanic herded them into a cargo van and hauled them away. No police sirens sounded, no cop cars followed. Diego collapsed into a folding chair, exhausted. It was over. He'd done it. 2 weeks later, Diego woke up earlier than usual. He had 7 upgrades El Carnicero wanted done by noon. He looked out the window down to the shop floor where his backlog of robots waited for him. After Juarez Square, the narco boss had moved Diego into the apartment above the workshop, a well-furnished prison, and gave him a thick roll of cash. More money than Lorenzo earned in a year, though Diego didn't have the freedom to spend it. Word had spread quickly about what went down at Juarez Square. Diego's street cred had gone through the roof. Everyone was talking about the 15-year-old robot genius from El Cuatro, who'd made a fool of the new police captain. Diego poured himself a cup of coffee and pictured Lorenzo having breakfast alone. Surely he'd heard about Juarez Square by now. He cringed at the memory of how he left things, at what Lorenzo probably thought of him now. But there was nothing he could do about it. A dozen armed guards kept the shop on lockdown around the clock. He had no phone, no internet, no way to contact his brother and tell him he'd had no choice. His only hope was to do what he was told, keep working on the bots, and stay patient. It might take another month or 2, maybe even a year. But at some point, an opportunity to escape would present itself. Then he'd sneak away, find Lorenzo, and tell him everything. And they could use the money to move somewhere far away, somewhere beyond the narco boss's reach. A rapid knocking on the door startled him. He opened and found a grim-faced Pedro and a couple bodyguards. Diego noticed the reattached finger, still bandaged and healing. The older boy handed him a pair of binoculars and said,
"You gotta come see this."
It was the first time Diego had left the warehouse since Juarez Square. For a moment, he considered making a run for it, but the bodyguards with their suspicious eyes and sawed-off shotguns made him reconsider. He followed Pedro down Cendejas Avenue at a run, the bodyguards following close behind. A few blocks later, the boys entered a 10-story abandoned building and rushed up the stairs.
"What is it? Tell me,"
Diego called out as he rounded another flight. Pedro took the steps 2 at a time and shouted back,
"You won't believe it till you see it. Hurry up!"
The boys reached the roof. Pedro led him to a far corner, then pointed down to the street. It looked like a war zone. The charred remains of 6, maybe 7 narco bots were scattered everywhere, some still smoldering. Diego wrinkled his nose at the acrid stench of the bots' melted plastic shells. He squinted and leaned forward. A strange-looking robot moved through the wreckage. His mouth dropped open as he recognized the state police seal on the bot's side panel. It was something out of a nightmare, this bulky, well-armored machine loaded with weapons. He'd only ever seen the bomb squad use robots, and they were tiny little things, not at all like this beast, this killing machine.
Puta madre, Diego said. Where'd they get that monster?
Pedro tapped his shoulder and pointed in another direction.
Over there! Look over there!
Diego peered through the binoculars. A block away from the parking lot, a dozen police milled about, smiling and laughing and gesturing toward the destruction. In the middle of the crowd stood Lorenzo, accepting handshakes from all sides. Lorenzo, dressed in a police uniform. The binoculars dropped from Diego's hand. His brother's words flashed across his mind.
I'll be damned if I let you use what I taught you to help that animal.
Diego lowered his head and thought of the moment he'd opened the apartment door to Pedro. A door that should have stayed closed. A door he'd never walk through again. Pedro shook his head, looking down at the destruction.
Man, your brother's got a lot to answer for.
Diego sighed and said to himself, "Not as much as I do."